Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into shame and autism. And we're taking a deep dive into this article from Cheap ABA called 9 Random Examples of Shame from Autism.
Yeah,
Something a lot of our listeners have asked us to explore further.
definitely. It's such a crucial topic. Shame can really weigh heavily on autistic individuals.
Yeah.
I think this article does a great job of shining a light on some of those hidden struggles.
Right, so the article starts by defining shame. It says it's this really intense feeling, often stemming from societal expectations,
Right.
stigma around autism, and even past experiences. It really emphasizes how shame can affect autistic people differently because of those, unique aspects of being autistic.
Absolutely. I think navigating a world that's not always designed for neurodiversity
Hmm.
can create a real minefield of situations where shame can kind of take root. It's almost like you're constantly encountering these subtle messages
Hmm.
that you're not quite fitting in or doing things the right way,
Mm.
which can be incredibly isolating.
Yeah. It's like everybody else got the instruction manual for life, and we're just left figuring it out as we go, which can be really tough. So the article then dives into these 9 random examples, and some of them are so relatable, even to someone who isn't autistic. And then others are so poignant because they highlight experiences that are very specific to autism.
Yeah. I think each one of these examples offers a really good glimpse into a particular struggle that autistic people face. And I think it's really fascinating to kind of unpack the why behind the shame. What makes these situations so charged for autistic individuals?
Hmm.
For instance, the first example the article talks about is small talk. Something I think a lot of people, autistic or not, can relate to that feeling of dread when they're faced with having to make small talk.
Oh, absolutely. It feels like I'm missing some secret code. So why do you think small talk is so difficult for autistic people specifically?
Well, I think it comes down to the fact that small talk really relies on these
Hmm.
unspoken social rules and subtle cues. It involves these rapid back and forth exchanges. And for many autistic individuals who really thrive on clear communication and process social information differently, this can be incredibly challenging. Imagine you're at a networking event and everyone around you seems to so effortlessly engage in these light, casual conversations. But for you, the constant shifting topics and the indirect language and the pressure to keep up with the pace
Hmm.
feels really overwhelming.
Right. So it's not about being unfriendly or disinterested. It's more about a fundamental mismatch between how autistic people communicate and those really subtle social expectations. So I can see how that mismatch, especially when it leads to awkwardness or negative reactions from others, could easily trigger those feelings of shame. So what are some practical strategies for navigating small talk? Besides just avoiding social situations altogether, because let's face it, that's tempting sometimes.
Yeah. I think first and foremost, self-compassion is crucial. It's okay to find small talk tough. Instead of beating yourself up about it, maybe try reframing your thinking. Can you shift your focus to engaging in deeper conversations with people who share your interests? Or if you do have to navigate small talk, maybe prepare some go-to phrases or questions in advance, almost like a script. Simple things like, how's your day going? What are you working on these days? Simple things like that can really help ease the pressure.
Yeah. It's about taking control of the situation where you can, rather than feeling completely powerless.
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone in this. A lot of people, even those who aren't autistic, find small talk challenging.
That is comforting to hear. Okay, so let's move on to another example from the article that I found particularly impactful: meltdowns, or feeling overwhelmed in public. I thought the article really captured how sensory sensitivities, and just like the autistic experience, can clash with what people expect from us in public.
Right? Imagine you're in a crowded shopping mall. The fluorescent lights are buzzing overhead. The music's blaring through the speakers. There are tons of conversations and movement happening all around you. For many autistic people, that sensory input can be incredibly overwhelming, even physically painful at times.
Yeah, it's like all your senses are just amplified. And you're bombarded with all this information that's so hard to filter. I can see how easily that could lead to a meltdown, especially in a public place where there's often little escape from all that sensory overload.
Exactly. And then on top of that sensory overload, there's the fear of being judged by others, people staring, whispering, or even getting angry because they don't understand what's happening. That judgment can be so incredibly painful and add another layer of shame to an already really challenging situation.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that fear of judgment. I remember one time.
I think it's so important to remember that meltdowns aren't about being difficult or attention-seeking. They're a natural response to an overwhelming situation, like a way for the nervous system to release all that pent-up stress and sensory overload.
That makes so much sense. So, what can someone do if they're experiencing sensory overload in public, or if they feel like a meltdown is coming on?
Well, first and foremost, you got to prioritize your own safety and well-being. If you can, try to remove yourself from that overwhelming environment, even if it's just to a quieter corner of the room or a different room entirely. And remember, you have the right to ask for help or support, whether it's from someone you're with or a staff member if you're in a store or a public place.
It's like hitting the pause button and giving yourself a moment to kind of regroup.
Exactly. And in the long term, working with a therapist or a counselor who understands autism can be incredibly valuable. They can help you develop coping mechanisms, like sensory regulation techniques, or communication strategies to advocate for your needs.
That sounds incredibly helpful. It's about recognizing that your needs are valid and you deserve support in meeting those needs. You're not too sensitive or overreacting. Your experiences are real and they matter.
Absolutely. And that leads us to another example from the article that I think is really relevant to many autistic individuals. The shame of not fitting into traditional gender roles. It's something that I think often gets overlooked in conversations about autism.
It's a really important point to bring up because gender identity and expression are totally separate from autism, but I do think the social expectations tied to gender can create unique challenges for autistic individuals. Like there's all this unspoken pressure to conform to these
Mm.
really narrow binary ideas about what it means to be male or female. And that can be difficult for anyone, but especially for autistic people who might not relate to those traditional categories at all.
Precisely. And the article highlights how autistic individuals might express their gender in ways that don't fit those neat categories, or might not feel comfortable with the gender they were assigned at birth. Imagine feeling like you're constantly being told you're doing gender wrong,
Mm.
whether it's through subtle cues or outright comments, or even just the lack of representation of diverse gender experiences that can be so isolating and invalidating, especially during adolescence and young adulthood, when identity formation is so crucial.
Yeah. I've heard from autistic folks who describe feeling like they're constantly performing a role, trying to act in ways that they think will be perceived as normal or acceptable based on their assigned gender. And that constant pressure to mask their authentic selves can be really emotionally draining and lead to a lot of shame and anxiety.
Absolutely. It's like being told that your authentic self isn't acceptable. And that message can have a profound impact on anyone, but especially for young people who are already navigating all the complexities of identity development.
So, how can we as a society start to challenge these rigid gender stereotypes and create an environment where autistic people feel more comfortable expressing their gender authentically?
Well, I think it starts with education and awareness. We need to break down those rigid gender stereotypes and create a society that's more accepting of diverse gender identities and expressions. And for autistic individuals who are struggling with this, I think finding supportive communities, whether online or in person, can be truly life-changing. Connecting with others who understand and validate your experiences can help you build self-acceptance and combat those feelings of shame.
It's about finding those spaces where you can just be yourself without fear of judgment, surrounded by people who celebrate your individuality, rather than trying to force you into a box.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that there's no one right way to be autistic or to express your gender. Your identity is valid, and you deserve to be celebrated for who you are.
I love that. And it kind of seamlessly connects back to sensory overload, which we touched on briefly earlier.
Sensory overload. So crucial to unpack this because sensory sensitivities are such a core part of the autistic experience, and yet they're often so misunderstood by those who don't share those sensitivities.
Yeah.
It's not simply about disliking certain sounds or textures. For many autistic people, sensory input can be incredibly intense, even painful at times. Imagine your senses are dialed up to 11, constantly bombarded with information that's really difficult to filter or process.
Yeah, that's such a good way to put it. It's like trying to have a conversation in a crowded, noisy room while someone's flashing strobe lights in your face and then being expected to just act like everything's totally fine. It sounds utterly exhausting and overwhelming.
Exactly. And when that sensory overload hits,
Yeah.
especially in public, it can lead to this cascade of difficult emotions: anxiety, fear,
Mm.
even panic. And then on top of all of that comes the shame.
The shame of feeling like you're losing control, of
Yeah.
not being able to handle something that other people seem to navigate so easily.
It's incredibly isolating.
Hmm.
And often that shame is compounded by the reactions of others, people staring, making comments, even getting angry. because they don't understand what's happening. It's like they're blaming you for having a natural response to an overwhelming situation.
It's heartbreaking because it comes from this lack of understanding and awareness about autism and sensory sensitivities. People might see the meltdown or the distress, but they don't see the internal struggle that led to it. So for someone who experiences sensory overload, what are some strategies that can help?
Well, first and foremost, remember that your experience is valid. Your sensitivities are real. You're not making it up. It's not about being too sensitive. It's just that your nervous system is wired differently, and that's okay.
That validation is so crucial. It's about reclaiming your own narrative and rejecting those messages that tell you you're overreacting or being dramatic.
Exactly. And practically speaking, there are things you can do to manage sensory overload. Start by identifying your triggers. What sights, sounds, textures, or smells tend to overwhelm you. Once you know your triggers, you can start to develop strategies to avoid or minimize them.
So if loud noises are a trigger, you might wear noise-canceling headphones in crowded environments. Or if certain textures bother you, you might choose clothing made from fabrics that feel comfortable against your skin. It's about taking control of your sensory environment as much as possible and equipping yourself with the tools you need to manage those overwhelming moments.
Precisely. And it's not just about avoidance. You can also work on building up your tolerance gradually through things like sensory integration therapy or desensitization techniques. But it's crucial to remember that you don't have to go through this alone. Don't be afraid to advocate for your needs. Let people know what you're experiencing and what helps you feel more comfortable. You deserve to be accommodated, not shamed.
I think that's such an important message for everyone to hear, whether you're autistic or not. We all have different sensory preferences and needs, and respecting those differences is essential for creating a more inclusive and compassionate society. And speaking of inclusivity, the article also touches on the challenges a lot of autistic people face in the workplace, and specifically the shame that can come from not being able to keep a job.
Right. This is a topic that I know hits close to home for so many. It's easy to internalize those messages that you're not good enough or not cut out for the working world, especially when jobs haven't worked out in the past. But it's important to remember that for many autistic people, the challenges they face in the workplace aren't about a lack of skill or intelligence. It's often about a mismatch between the demands of the job and their strengths and needs.
Yeah, I've heard that from a lot of autistic folks. It's not that they're incapable of working, it's that the traditional workplace environment just often isn't set up to accommodate their unique ways of thinking and processing information.
Exactly. Maybe the work environment is too chaotic or unpredictable, or the social interactions are too draining, or maybe the tasks require a level of flexibility or multitasking that's just not a good fit for their cognitive style.
Right. It makes sense that when those mismatches happen, it can lead to stress, anxiety, burnout, and ultimately job loss. And then that in turn can really trigger this spiral of shame and self-doubt. It's like this vicious cycle where you feel ashamed that you lost the job, which makes it even harder to find a new one. And that just reinforces those feelings of inadequacy.
It's a painful cycle to be trapped in, and it really highlights the need for greater awareness and understanding of neurodiversity in the workplace.
So what can help break that cycle? What advice would you give to someone who's struggling to find their place in the working world?
Self-awareness is key. Understand your strengths, your challenges, your sensory and social needs, and then look for jobs that align with those strengths and accommodate those needs.
So maybe that means seeking out a work environment that's more structured and predictable, or a role that allows for more independent work, rather than constant collaboration. It's about finding a good fit, a place where you can actually thrive and utilize your unique talents and perspectives.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to disclose your autism during the hiring process if you feel comfortable doing so.
Oh,
It allows you to advocate for your needs
yeah.
and make sure that the job is a good fit from the very start.
That's a great point. It also opens up the conversation about neurodiversity
Uh,
and helps to create a more inclusive workplace culture. And speaking of unique talents and perspectives, this actually ties into another example from the article that I related to, the shame of not being able to mask our autistic traits.
yes, masking.
Ah.
This is such a pervasive experience for many autistic people. And it goes to the heart of what it means to be autistic in a world that often doesn't understand or accept neurodiversity.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly trying to fit into a mold that wasn't designed for us. We're contorting ourselves to meet these expectations that don't align with our authentic selves at all. And that can be so exhausting and emotionally draining.
I think you put it perfectly. Masking is this process of trying to hide or suppress your autistic traits, just to fit in or avoid negative judgments from others. It can be like putting on a performance. constantly monitoring your behavior and trying to appear normal.
Right. And when you can't maintain that performance, when your autistic traits kind of slip through, it can feel like this huge failure, like you've been found out or exposed as being different.
Exactly. And that feeling of being exposed can be incredibly shame-inducing. It's like you've been trying so hard to hide a part of yourself that you've been told is unacceptable. And then when that part of yourself becomes visible, it triggers all this negative self-talk and self-judgment.
It's heartbreaking because it just reinforces this idea that there's something inherently wrong or shameful about being autistic, and that's simply not true. I think it's so important to challenge those negative messages. There's nothing wrong with being autistic. Your autistic traits are not flaws or defects. They're part of who you are, and they deserve to be celebrated.
Absolutely. It's about shifting the focus from trying to fit in to embracing your authentic self. And that's not to say that masking is always bad. Sometimes it can be a necessary coping mechanism in certain situations.
Right. If you're in a situation where you feel unsafe or vulnerable, masking might help protect you.
Exactly. But it's important to recognize the cost of masking and to find ways to minimize it whenever possible. Maybe that means creating safe spaces in your life where you can be yourself without masking, or surrounding yourself with people who accept and appreciate you for who you are, autistic traits and all.
It's about finding your tribe, your people, the ones who celebrate your neurodiversity, rather than trying to erase it.
Yes, precisely. And it's about advocating for a world that's more understanding and accepting of neurodiversity, a world where autistic people don't feel pressure to mask their true selves.
A world where we can all just be our authentic selves without fear of shame or judgment. That's a beautiful vision. And speaking of authenticity and acceptance, let's talk about the article's closing message about embracing your autistic identity and seeking out supportive communities.
Ah, yes, that's such a powerful and hopeful message because those two things, embracing your autistic identity and finding your community, are so interconnected. When you're surrounded by people who understand and accept you for who you are, autistic traits and all, it becomes so much easier to shed those layers of shame and embrace your authentic self. It's like finding your tribe, your people, a place where you belong.
And those communities can be found in so many places.
Yeah.
Online forums and support groups, in-person meetups and social events. Even just connecting with one or two other autistic individuals who get it can make such a difference. It's about finding those spaces where you can be yourself without judgment, where you can share your experiences and learn from others who have walked a similar path.
And those communities aren't just about support. They're also about celebrating the strengths and unique perspectives that come with being autistic.
You're right. It's about shifting the narrative from a deficit-based model of autism to one that recognizes the value and beauty of neurodiversity.
Exactly. And when we start to embrace our autistic identities and celebrate our neurodiversity, we can start to dismantle all those systems of shame and stigma that have held us back for so long.
It's about reclaiming our power and defining what it means to be autistic on our own terms.
And it's about creating a world where autistic people can thrive and live authentically, without fear of shame or judgment.
That is such a great vision, and it's something we can all work towards, whether we're autistic or not.
Absolutely. It starts with education, with awareness,
Yeah.
with challenging our own biases and assumptions about autism.
And it's about amplifying the voices of autistic people, listening to their stories, and learning from their lived experiences.
Because ultimately,
Yeah.
we're all better off when we embrace diversity in all its forms.
You know, as we wrap up this deep dive into shame and autism, I'm left thinking about, how we can create change.
Yeah.
How we can shift those societal expectations.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot about the importance of finding supportive communities,
Right.
embracing your autistic identity.
It really is key.
And I think it's important to remember that creating a more accepting world starts with each of us as individuals.
What do you mean?
Well, we can start by educating ourselves about autism, challenging our own biases,
Right.
and really listening to autistic people.
Yeah.
It's about amplifying their voices and understanding their experiences.
And celebrating their strengths.
Exactly.
Instead
Yeah.
of focusing on perceived deficits.
It's about recognizing that neurodiversity is a valuable part of human diversity.
I love that. It's about seeing the world through a different lens and appreciating the unique perspectives that autistic people bring to the table.
Absolutely. And when we start to do that, we create a world where everyone feels seen and valued for who they are.
That's the kind of world I want to live in, a world that embraces difference and celebrates neurodiversity.
Me too.
So to all our listeners out there, Whether you're autistic or not, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to take action to create a more inclusive and accepting world for autistic people.
And remember, you're not alone on this journey. There are amazing communities out there ready to welcome you with open arms.
So keep learning, keep connecting, and keep diving deep. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us.